Very good. Well, once again, thanks everybody for joining us here today for cyber incident response from Policy to Practice. I'm Lee Hodgson and joined by our senior cybersecurity consultant, Georgia Turnham. So thanks for being here today with us, Georgia.
That's all good.
So today we are talking about moving beyond the technology side of cybersecurity into what incident response looks like in practice. So when something goes wrong, I guess a lot of us here today, we've got security controls in place. We may or may not have good incident response plans in place as well. But I think a lot of us have probably not been down the path of actually testing how those things come together under real world pressure, which is really important. I think when we think about a cyber incident, it's often the technical response that gets a lot of the focus. So that's things like getting systems back up and running, IT restoring backups and fixing things that broke. But the reality is that a cyber incident today is a lot more complex than that. And I guess how well or how poorly that can go for you often comes down to the decisions that are made within the early parts, whether that's the first few hours or days. So when there is a cyber incident, there are decisions that need to be made that affect everything from business continuity, but also your community. You need to think about communication with clients, staff, boards if you have one, regulators as well, insurers, and there are other stakeholders just depending on how your organization is structured, industry, those sorts of things. So, and you've got to weigh all of those up, those notification requirements, your insurance obligations, legal, financial exposure, reputation, and operational impact, and all that stuff. And it's often in a high pressure situation where there's time pressure. You may not have all the information that you might have about that event. So if you get those decisions right and an incident can be contained, managed, and recovered from fairly easy. But at the same time, if you get those things wrong, you could be looking, they can escalate quickly, and you could be looking at everything from obviously delaying your recovery and getting back to business as usual, fines or enforcement action, insurance issues, or maybe making that reputation damage worse than it could have been. So over this session, Georgia is going to cover a little bit more about the importance of preparedness, validating and testing controls, and what effective incident response effective incident response plan looks like. We'll also walk through a short interactive cyber incident response tabletop simulation, which I'm looking forward to. So this is set up to help you think through some of those decisions, the roles and response steps. And as I said, we want this to be interactive. So throughout the tabletop, you'll see some questions and polls pop up. So yeah, please pop your answers in there. It's all completely anonymous. So you can answer honestly, and there's definitely no right or wrong answers here either. And hopefully at the end, we'll have a bit of time for Q&A if it's needed. So please feel free to use the Q&A function there within the Teams webinar, and we'll try and get to them towards the end. So Georgia, I'm going to hand over to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Lee. So let's talk about preparedness and protection and why they matter now. For years, we've been focused on the idea of protection from a cybersecurity incident rather than the concept of preparedness. However, in today's day and age, we need to shift the mindset from prevention only to preparedness for when something goes wrong and gets through our defenses. There's a reason for this shift in focus and why incident preparedness is now something that needs to be front of mind. And the first reason that it's important is because the threat landscape has fundamentally changed. So when I talk about this, I'm talking about how attacks are now more sophisticated, more frequent, and more varied than ever. Nation-state actors, ransomware groups, and supply chain attackers have shown repeatedly that no defense is truly impenetrable. The assumption that you can keep everything out is no longer realistic, and it's not a matter of if a security incident will occur, it's a matter of when it will occur. Not only that, but the cost of being caught off guard is also enormous. When an organization has no incident response plan in place, breaches tend to last longer, spread further, and cause far more damage, both financially and, like Lee mentioned, reputationally. Companies that are prepared for an incident can detect, contain, and recover quicker and suffer dramatically less impact than those struggling to figure out what to do to protect systems that may be at risk. It's also important because regulatory and compliance expectations have raised the bar. Frameworks such as GDPR, NIST CSF, and ISO 27001 now explicitly require incident response and preparedness to be baked into organizational activities. Not only that, but regulators are wanting to see that you're able to respond effectively and were prepared and are ready to mitigate the impact of an incident. You'll also know that regulatory requirements often have a time frame for us to report incidents in certain situations. So for the OAIC, there's a time frame of reporting within 30 days of understanding that an incident or a notifiable data breach has occurred. Not only that, but the attack surface keeps expanding. Cloud adoption, remote work, IoT devices, third-party integrations, and AI tools have all dramatically increased the number of entry points into an organization. Defending every single entry to your organization perfectly is simply not feasible. However, being prepared for when one of these entry points is or may be compromised is just as important as trying to prevent a breach in the first place. And lastly, the main reason preparedness is now important is because it builds organizational resilience. Preparedness isn't just about the technical response, it's about communication plans, role clarity, forensic procedures, and business continuity. Organizations that treat incidents as something to prepare for rather than simply prevent tend to be far more resilient overall. Being prepared for an incident is imperative to enable your organization in being ready to respond to an incident. But more importantly, prepare your systems, networks, and applications as well, and ensure that they're sufficiently secure. Being prepared isn't something you do once and then tick off a list. It's something that you have to validate continuously. That starts with understanding what you actually have in place versus what you think you have in place. And the fastest way to close that gap is to test it. But testing isn't just one thing, and there are a number of different tests that you can use at different stages. Two main tests, penetration testing and cybersecurity risk assessments, are two complementary practices that significantly enhance an organization's security preparedness and protection capabilities. Together, they provide a comprehensive view of the security landscape, enabling proactive identification and remediation of vulnerabilities before they can be exploited by malicious actors. Penetration testing and risk assessments serve different purposes, so knowing when to use each one matters. A risk assessment gives you the broad picture. Where are the exposures? What's the likelihood? What's the impact? And it's where you should start with your testing. A well-informed risk assessment looks at your entire environment and asks, what are we exposed to? How likely is it that something goes wrong? And what would be the impact if it did? It doesn't try to exploit anything or prove a vulnerability exists. It maps the landscape. It identifies the gaps between where you are and where you need or want to be. If you're an organization that hasn't done any formal security review, or if you're trying to understand your overall risk profile before committing budget to specific fixes, a risk assessment is the right first step. Penetration testing, however, goes a lot deeper. It actively probes your defenses to see what an attacker could actually exploit, and it's most valuable when you already have a baseline understanding of your environment and you want to stress test specific areas. The mistakes organizations make is jumping straight to a pen test without having done any groundwork. A penetration test without proper scoping and context is like stress testing a bridge without first understanding how it was built. You might find something, but you might actually also miss the things that matter. The real value of either exercise isn't in the report it produces, it's in what you do with it. And that's where scoping becomes critical. If you don't define clearly what's being tested, why, and what the boundaries are, the findings become white noise. Get the scope right, though, and you can take those findings and turn them into a concrete 90-day plan, prioritized by risk with owners, deadlines, checkpoints, risk measurements, and things that actually move your security posture forward rather than just documenting where it currently sits. So, scoping a security assessment. Now let's look at scoping a security assessment. Scoping is where most of the value or most of the waste in either exercise gets decided. Get it wrong and you end up with findings that don't matter, or you miss the things that do. The way you scope a penetration test and risk assessment is fundamentally different because they're trying to answer different questions. So if we're scoping a risk assessment, we're looking at being a lot broader. The whole point is to understand the full picture, what you have, what's exposed, and where the biggest vulnerabilities sit. So the scoping conversation starts with the business, not the technology. What are the critical assets? What processes handle sensitive data or money? What would actually hurt the organization if it failed or was compromised? You're trying to make sure nothing important is left out. The boundaries you set should be around what's relevant to the organization's operations and risk appetite, not around what's convenient or easy to review. When scoping a risk assessment, it's important to define the boundaries of what you're looking at and making sure those boundaries are relevant and reflect what matters to the organization. The first question should be about, what does the organization care about protecting? Here we're trying to understand critical business functions, the assets, which are the people and technology that support them, and the impact if those assets were compromised, unavailable, or destroyed. It's just as important to identify what's out of scope as well. Being explicit about exclusions prevents scope creep and keeps the assessment focused on areas where findings can actually lead to action. Scoping also means agreeing on how the assessment will be conducted. Will it be based on interviews, a documentation review, technical scanning, or a combination? The level of depth you drill down to should match the organization's needs and criticality of the assets being assessed. It's also really important that you agree on the ownership and accountability. Who owns the assessment? Who's responsible for providing the information and access the assessors will need? Who will receive the findings and who has the authority to act on them? These questions need to have answers before the work starts, because a risk assessment only creates value if the findings land with someone who can actually do something about them. If there's no clear ownership, the report becomes a document that gets filed and forgotten. Meanwhile, scoping a penetration test needs to be precise. Unlike a risk assessment which casts a wide net, a penetration test is targeted. You're not looking at everything, you're looking at specific things for specific reasons with specific boundaries. Start with clear objectives before you define what's in scope. And to determine what's in scope, you need to define why you're doing the test. What are you trying to prove or validate? The scoping, assessment, and conversation then starts with what you already know or suspect. What systems are you most concerned about? What are the crown jewels or the assets that, if compromised, would cause the most damage? From there, you define exactly what's in scope and exactly what isn't. Once you know the objectives and the critical assets, you can define exactly what can be tested. Which systems? Which applications? Which networks or IP ranges? Be specific. Simply test the web application isn't enough. You need to specify which components, which functionality, which endpoints, which ones are off limits. Additionally, who knows the test is happening? Here we need to define the rules of engagement. These are written down and agreed before anything starts, because once a pen test is underway, the last thing you want is ambiguity around what the tester is and isn't allowed to do. A couple of other things that are critical to scope out include the time frame. So when will the test happen and how long will it take? Communication protocols. What happens if the tester finds something critical? And the level of access required for the test to be performed. One non-negotiable that comes with performing any test, whether it be a risk assessment or a penetration test, is getting written authorization. Before anything happens, you need explicit, documented permission from someone with the authority to grant it. The authorization should cover what's being tested, what methods are permitted, the time frame, and any exclusions or restrictions. Developing a roadmap is then equally important. Once you've performed an assessment, you need to map out a pathway to implement improvements based on the gaps that were found. A cybersecurity roadmap is a strategic planning document that outlines an organization's security objectives, initiatives, and timelines over a defined period. Developing a comprehensive roadmap is essential for effective preparedness and protection because it transforms reactive security management into a proactive, structured program aligned with the business objectives and evolving threats. Assessment results, whether they be from a penetration test or a risk assessment, are really only valuable if they lead to action. Turning those findings into a roadmap bridges the gap between knowing what's wrong and actually fixing it. To develop your roadmap, you need to do the following. You need to triage and prioritize. Not everything that comes out of your testing reports is equally as urgent. You need to triage and prioritize your findings based on severity and business impact. The findings that score high on both severity and business impact go to the top of the list to be remediated. You need to group findings into themes. Once you've prioritized your findings, you need to group them into themes. Grouping findings into themes or work packages makes it easier to tackle in a roadmap because it highlights complementary issues that all fall under the same topic or subject. This then allows you to undertake work packages that address multiple issues at once. 3, you also need to sort time into buckets. Trying to do everything at once will overwhelm your team and will result in work going missed or being poorly addressed. To best address the initiatives on your roadmap, you need to break them down into windows, each with a clear focus on the initiative and the tasks to resolve it. First up in your roadmap should be anything that can be considered a quick win. These are the findings that can be fixed quickly, often with minimal resource investment or disruption. Quick wins build momentum, demonstrate progress, and often reduce risk significantly for relatively little effort. Prioritize the quick wins that also address high severity or high impact findings. These give you the biggest return in the shortest time. You'll also need to map any dependencies you might have. Some fixes rely on others happening first. Before you lock in a roadmap, map out the dependencies so you know what needs to happen in what order. And then number 5, amongst other things to note when developing a roadmap, one critical thing that is often overlooked is communicating the plan. Once the roadmap is built, it needs to be communicated, not just to the people doing the work, but to the stakeholders who also need to know it's happening. There are a number of challenges that can be faced when developing a roadmap. And the biggest mistake is treating the roadmap as a static document. Threats change, business priorities shift, and new vulnerabilities emerge. If the roadmap doesn't adapt, it very quickly becomes irrelevant. The second mistake is overloading your roadmap. If you try to fix everything at once, you'll spread your resources too thin and nothing will get done properly. Focus on the things that matter most and accept that some findings will just have to wait. The third mistake is building the roadmap in isolation. If the people who have to implement the fixes aren't involved in building the plan, they won't own it and it won't get done. When it does come to preparedness, a cybersecurity incident response plan is of the utmost importance. And we've provided one here for you today as well. An incident response plan is the backbone of an organization's ability to handle a security breach effectively and efficiently. Without one, teams are left to improvise under pressure, which leads to slower detection, poor coordination, and greater damage, both to systems and the organization's reputation. A well-structured plan ensures that everyone knows their role, communication channels are clear, and critical decisions can be made quickly, turning what could be a chaotic crisis into a controlled and measured process. When it comes to cybersecurity incident response plans, there are two levels of documents that may be followed: a higher level incident response policy and a more granular incident response plan. A high level incident response policy sets the direction and expectations. It defines the organization's overall commitments to handling security incidents. It outlines broad principles. It assigns accountability at a strategic level and establishes things like scope, objectives, and compliance requirements. Think of it as the why and what. It tells the organization that incidents must be handled and what standards that handling should be met. Meanwhile, an incident response plan is the practical step-by-step document that puts the policy into action. It details the specific procedures, roles, responsibilities, timelines, communication protocols, and even the tools that teams will use when an incident actually occurs. Think of it as the how. It tells people exactly what to do when things go wrong. A cyber incident response plan varies in its presentation depending on the organization you're in. However, all good plans and policies will have a few features in common, and these are all included in best practice documentation. We've provided an almost complete template for you today to take away and implement in your own organizations, and it addresses some of the key points that you need in an incident response plan. So you've got to have the strategies and goals, or the mission. This defines the overall purpose and objectives of the incident response plan, giving the organization a clear direction and ensuring that all actions taken during an incident are aligned with the broader security and business goals. Then you've got to have your roles and responsibilities. This section should outline the roles and responsibilities of core individuals and teams responsible for incident response and decision making. So that's making sure you have your incident response team defined, you've got your executive team defined, and sometimes you've got your cyber insurance roles outlined as well. You also need to have an organizational approach to incident response. So this section establishes how the organization as a whole will handle its incidents. Typically, this is mapped across the incident lifecycle, which is outlined by NIST, and ensures there's a unified and consistent approach rather than having individual teams operating in silos or making decisions independently. Then you have your legal and communication requirements. So this outlines the organization's legal obligations and regulatory duties when a breach occurs, including mandatory notification timelines, such as within 30 days for breach notification. In some cases, this must be within 72 hours, so you've got a lot shorter timeline to act. And for your reporting requirements, ensuring that the organisation remains compliant and avoids costly penalties. You also need to have evidence handling guidelines. This provides clear procedures or a clear statement about the collection, preservation, and documentation of evidence during an incident. And this is critical for forensic investigations, legal proceedings, and ensuring the integrity of any data captured is maintained. Another component of your plan that you'll need to have outlined, whether it be in a paragraph or a sentence or two, is your supplier engagement. This defines how third-party suppliers and vendors will be involved, communicated with, and managed during an incident, particularly one that impacts them. And this is becoming increasingly important given that many breaches are now originating from or are impacted by the supply chain that we've got. And finally, you need to have executive thresholds and escalation call trees. These set a clear criteria for when an incident needs to be escalated to senior leadership and provides a defined chain of communication to follow, ensuring that the right people are informed and involved at the right time without unnecessary delays. It's also really important here, and I'll make a quick note, to make sure you actually manage your communications effectively. You don't want to be spending your entire incident response relaying information to senior management. So it's important that you set a defined cadence that you're going to engage with them and give them updates, which then allows your team to operate with a bit more focus and direction. Now, like I mentioned earlier, for today's attendees, we've supplied a high-level overview of an incident response plan. There's a few gaps in the plan where you'll need to provide context or information, turn it into a ready-to-go IR plan, but a lot of the heavy lifting has been done for you. In today's day and age, having a plan on paper is really only half the battle. The real test comes when an incident actually unfolds, and that's what we're about to walk through right now. Tabletop exercises bridge the gap between policy and practice by bringing to life a plan and validating the plan's effectiveness, exposing gaps, and building confidence and coordination before a real incident occurs. Incident response tabletop exercises are critical for preparedness because they test plans, roles, and decision-making in a safe, controlled environment before a real crisis occurs. They expose gaps in processes, clarify responsibilities, and build the muscle memory needed to respond quickly and confidently under pressure. A tabletop exercise is one of the most valuable tools an organization can use to stress test its incident response capabilities without the pressure and chaos of a real-world event. It brings together key stakeholders from across the organization and walks them through a realistic cyber threat scenario, challenging them to think critically, make decisions, and communicate effectively, all in a safe, controlled environment. Perhaps most importantly, tabletop simulations are a critical component of any organization's ongoing preparedness posture. They ensure that our incident response plan is not just a document sitting on a shelf, but it's a living and breathing framework that is regularly tested, refined, and improved upon. Now, in the mini scenario we've got today, as we'll progress through it, I'll ask a couple of yes or no questions, and it would be great to get your feedback on the polls. And just reiterating what Lee mentioned earlier, the polls are completely anonymous, so your answers won't be tied back to you. And with that, we'll start the scenario. So while we'll have a look at some considerations. As we progress through the scenario, you'll notice some questions on the side of the page. We won't spend too much time dwelling on these. However, when assessing an incident response team, asking question assists the facilitator by helping them probe you to get a sense as to how the posture of the incident response function currently stands. For today, we've taken and turned the open-ended questions you'd ask tabletop participants into yes and no questions to prompt you to think about your own incident response function and your organization's preparedness. We've also narrowed the number of questions we ask down to make it a little easier for the polls. Typically, when a facilitator asks these questions, they're also aligning them with the incident response lifecycle stages and where you're at. And they're also pulling and tugging on things that are in your incident response plan. And it's making sure it's aligned with what's stated in the incident response plan. So to start off, ahead at the end of the month, an email comes through to the accounts payable from a supplier requesting a change in the bank account details that their invoice of $52,000 will be paid into. The email signature, tone, and supplier name all match, and the email includes a historical conversation, an email train. The email has a request not to call to confirm the payment request, as the individual is at a conference all day. So there's a couple of things we consider here. The first one is your organization, does it have in place the segregation of duties for when it comes to payment? The segregation of duties is simply about dividing responsibilities so no one person has complete control over an entire process. An example of an everyday situation where we employ the segregation of duties is when hiring someone. So you've got manager A who interviews the candidates, HR verifies the references and qualifications, and the final offer might be sent out by a director. By separating evaluation, verification, and authorization, the organization reduces the risk of bias, favoritism, or error. So no single individual has end-to-end control over the entire process. We might also ask, was there a policy in place requiring out-of-band verification, like a phone call, before a payment of this size could be approved? And we also might ask, at this time, are there any red flags that this may be a case of business email compromise? And I might throw it out to the audience here. What red flags did you spot? The first red flag that I note is that the email has a request not to call the individual as they're at a conference all day. And I can see here also in the poll, 71% of you guys have full segregation of duties in place, which is really good. 23% of us have some segregation exists, but not across all payment steps. And 4% of us have no segregation of duties. And 100% of you spotted that there were some indicators of a business email compromise event. So yes, what we can do is we can take the information and make actionable decisions that improve the incident response function. For example, here we're testing whether there's a segregation of duties in place between finance and the broader company. And that's really important to have to make sure that payments aren't being processed by one individual by themselves. So the transaction was flagged for approval and the approval request has landed with the head of finance, but it's landed with the mother in back-to-back meetings. The head of finance simply recognized the vendor and saw his employee Diane's name on the thread and immediately approved the payment, trusting the name and the person blindly. In these sorts of scenarios, we'd consider whether a one-click approval process for payments is adequate and instead consider a two-step approval process. One step being the physical approved button, and another being a secondary confirmation with the vendor about the request via an out-of-band channel such as a phone call. Together, having these two steps reduces the likelihood of an attacker successfully executing a fraudulent request. So let's throw it out to the audience again. Does your organization have a rule that any payment over a certain threshold requires dual approval? And yes, it looks like 59% of you have dual approval is required for payments above a certain threshold. Well, that's jumped to 67. And 17% of us don't have visibility, and 13% have no payment requiring a dual approval based on thresholds. What requiring dual approval for payments over a set thresholds adds is a critical safeguard against financial fraud during cyber incidents. It helps prevent attackers, whether that's through business email compromise, account taker, or even insider threat, from executing large unauthorized transactions by ensuring a second independent review. This extra checkpoint slows down adversaries, it increases the chance of detecting suspicious activity early, and it creates useful audit trails for forensic investigation. Overall, it goes to help strengthen detection, containment, and recovery efforts, particularly during financially motivated security incidents. And what we've seen here is a sharp rise in business email compromise and account takeovers of late. So moving the scenario on, a week later, the supplier is called Roden to ask where the payment was, as they were yet to receive anything. Diane reports that the account was paid last week, as we saw. But when the IT team go back to review the $52,000 transaction, they notice the email sender name was off by one symbol. Questions that we probe the responding team for at this stage include steps we may take to contain the incident, such as do they pause all outbound payments until further assurance around the legitimacy of those payments can be ascertained. We also start to ask questions such as, do we need to bring in an external incident response capability from a retainer if we've got one? So I'll throw it to the audience quickly for this one. Does your organization have a payment recall procedure? Most business banking environments expect organizations may need to recall payments due to errors or fraud. So thinking where we're at now, we need to act quickly and we need to contain the incident. Sometimes this can't be done on our own and we need to call in an independent firm to assist. But the wait times can vary before help arrives, unless of course you're prepared and you have someone on retainer for when an incident unfolds. So as I saw in the last poll, a lot of us are unsure about whether or not we have a payment recall procedure in place, which can make it difficult when we're responding to an incident. So now it's time for another poll. Does your organization have an incident response party on retainer? And how many here have an incident response team or a forensic partner on retainer with defined SLA times? And this is really good to see. We've got 60% have a formal retainer in place. 50%. Whereas 25%, that's dropped. Partially seems to be common here, where there's a partial preferred vendor but no formal retainer. 45% of us have a formal retainer in place, and 25%, a quarter of us here today, don't have an external IR or forensics team on retainer. Having an incident response retainer on call is essential for organizational preparedness because it provides immediate access to specialized expertise the moment an incident occurs. This allows for faster containment, coordinated action, and guidance on legal and regulatory obligations, reducing potential financial, operational, and reputational damage. Finally, we come to the last inject of the scenario, and this presents the eradication and recovery phase of the incident response lifecycle. Although today we're doing a micro simulation and it's a bit shorter, we will still bring it to a conclusion by recovering from the incident. So now the bank has been contacted by Rodent as soon as the fraudulent email was detected. However, the bank can't recall the funds and the account receiving the money has already been emptied. At this point, we start to ask questions about notification and recovering from the incident. Do we notify the authorities or insurance? Does your insurance even cover business email compromise or insider threats? What does this conversation look like and who does it happen with? A lot of the time, insurance don't cover business email compromise or insider threats. They have some little workarounds on that. So it looks like a majority of us would notify both the authorities and the insurance. And 14% of us would notify the authorities but don't have insurance. Now, just as quickly as it begun, we've come to the end of the scenario, a point where the pressure has been titrated up to see how the team would respond. This scenario represents a micro simulation, so it's a narrow slice of an incident focused on a single fraud event and its immediate consequences. Sometimes the exercise exposes control gaps, delayed decisions, or breakdowns in communication, and that is precisely the point. The value lies not in winning the scenario, but in uncovering weaknesses and strengthening preparedness before a real incident occurs. Concluding an incident response tabletop exercise usually brings a sense of closure as the team steps back from the simulated pressure and shifts into reflection mode. The winding down phase focuses on capturing lessons learned, what worked well, and identifying gaps, turning the scenario from a simulated crisis into a valuable improvement opportunity. Now, in a full tabletop exercise, this is where we'd move into a hot wash discussion, which is a group discussion where we sit down together and talk through what went well and what didn't, what needs to change. Every person in the room would have a chance to contribute, and the findings and action items would be built out collectively from that conversation. So, for example, what went well today was that, a lot of us have insurance and would notify both the authorities and insurer during the event. What could be improved? There weren't many of us, under half of us had a formal retainer in place, which means that if an incident does occur, you may experience delayed timelines in getting any assistance from coming in. And another thing that could be improved is being aware of having a payment recall procedure. It's a good control to have in place to prevent fraud incidents. And I highly recommend you have a discussion with your bank about setting up a recall procedure if one doesn't exist. But in the interest of time, we'll be skipping the big hot wash for now. That being said, the questions it would raise don't go away. So what processes failed? Where were the gaps? What would need to change to stop this next time? And those conversations are really worth having, whether that's in a follow-up session, a written debrief, or a broader review with the wider team. So what does being prepared look like? Well, hopefully after today, you're all going away with a better idea of what preparedness looks like and not just protection. It involves shifting our mindset from completely stopping bad things from happening, which is impossible, to being prepared and knowing what to do when those protections fail, because at some point they will. To sum up what good looks like from the perspective of preparedness, there's a couple of different things you need to be doing. Organizations should develop a clear incident response plan for when things go wrong, and they should regularly test it through structured tabletop exercises. Now, I'm not saying you have to test it every week, but annually is optimal. Using assessments such as penetration tests and risk assessments to gauge security maturity and identify gaps is equally as critical. These should be conducted at least annually and sooner if there are significant changes to the organization's internal or external environment. And for a penetration test, that should happen prior to any system going live. Once issues are identified, they must be translated into action. A cybersecurity roadmap takes those findings and addresses them in a prioritized, resourced, and time-bound manner with clear ownership assigned. In effect, the roadmap becomes your preparedness blueprint, outlining the initiatives that strengthen capability and improve overall organizational resilience. On a more granular basis, there are a range of controls that are beneficial in implementing in your organization to maximize potential for being prepared for a cyber incident. And these include multi-factor authentication enabled on all your accounts, and prioritize privileged and administrator accounts because they have a greater level of access to your environment. You should also have a strong password policy. A minimum of 12 characters and a mixture of upper and lowercase symbols and numbers is recommended. Ensure that you have auto updates for software enabled on your device. You should also be performing security awareness training for all your employees, targeting the employees who are in high-risk profiles and high-risk positions. You should also put in place vetting for your third-party suppliers. And you should also ensure you have antivirus software deployed across your entire fleet of endpoints. In addition to this, adopting the Essential 8 controls is another critical step you can take right now to improve your baseline maturity. The Essential 8 are a set of Australian cybersecurity mitigation strategies designed to prevent attacks, limit their impact, and support recovery by focusing on a few key areas, including application control, patching, configuration hardening, user access management, and data backup. And with that, that brings me to the end, and I'll hand it back to Lee.
Thank you, Georgia. That was excellent. Although poor Diane from accounts, I hope she's okay.
Yeah, she's had a rough day.
Absolutely. So just as we wrap up, we've obviously covered why preparedness matters more than ever, and how testing your controls and perimeters gives you clarity on risk, where your incident response plans fit in, and also how a tabletop exercise can help you to validate them and make sure that everything comes together and works well under pressure. So yeah, technology and the things we do to protect our systems is still still important, but it's really only a part of cyber resilience. The other half is your people, your process, having those clear roles, right discussions and response steps, and having them tested before an incident recurs. So you're not kind of working them out at the time. So most cyber incidents, they don't escalate due to a lack of technology can be a problem, but it's not that alone. It's that preparedness as well. So for a lot of organizations, the challenge is knowing, I guess, where to start and how to pull this all together in a practical and prioritized way. That's where Roden comes in, and George's team. So she specializes in cybersecurity services, working with organizations across that full life cycle, from understanding risk and validating controls through to response planning, running these full tabletop exercises, and that ongoing improvement. So whether that's assessments, roadmaps, awareness, the focus is always with Georgia on building that real world resilience, that practical and also preparedness. So if there is anything that we've discussed today, or any questions, we've highlighted perhaps any gaps maybe, that's exactly the conversation we can have with you. So we are running short on time, so if there are any questions, please you can pop them in the Q&A, or please feel free to reach out to us directly after if you want to take it offline. Just pop over to that last slide though, because Georgia did touch on it earlier. So we'll be sending this out to everyone today. We've built with Georgia a cyber incident response plan template and kit. So it's a working document with an incident response plan template that you can use, instructions on how to complete and use the document. So if you don't yet have one, it's a good starting point, or if you do have one, it's useful to benchmark and validate what's in place and identify gaps. And obviously the other important part is, are we going to test it later? So thank you all for joining us. You haven't seen anything come through on the Q&A, so I think we'll call it a day there. So thank you very much. I hope you've all found that that valuable, and thanks again for joining us.